Welcome to the first session of our newest webinar series, Cradle to Career Clarity, hosted by the Hunt Institute. This series has been organized by the Hunt Institute's policy team to highlight the importance of data access and quality within each level of the education continuum. We are excited to have you all here. I'm Megan Zogby, mentioned earlier. For those that may be unfamiliar, the Hunt Institute is a national nonprofit dedicated to supporting and advising education leaders and policymakers nationwide on education issues across the education continuum. The webinar series will examine how transparent, high quality, and timely education data can help advance overall success across the P20 continuum, and it will also highlight the role of analysis, cross-sector collaboration, and ethical data use. Families need clear, accessible information to make informed decisions, whether choosing a preschool or a college program. Educators and policymakers also rely on data to identify gaps, guide interventions, and align education with workforce needs. I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator, Bethany Miller, Vice President of Planning, Learning, and Impact at Ascendium. Ascendium is a national grant maker. They value and invest in the data infrastructure needed to ensure our post-secondary education and workforce systems deliver upward mobility for our nation's low-income students. Please join me in welcoming Bethany Miller.
Thanks, Megan, for that introduction. Last week, when I agreed to step into this moderator role, I did so because these conversations about data are just critically important to not only understanding what's happening in our systems and organizations and with our students, but to actually do something about it. So each of our panelists will speak to that data use opportunity we have here as we turn to them. In terms of structure, I'm going to quickly introduce one panelist, ask her a question, have her respond before I turn to the next panelist. That means we're going to do that 3 times in quick succession. And then I'm going to ask one question of all 3 panelists before turning over to you, the audience, for the questions you have. We should pivot to you and your questions at about the halfway mark. So get ready, start putting those in the Q&A chat function at the bottom. We've got a really robust slate of panelists and conversation topics to get through. So super excited to get us started. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce first Jennifer Bell Ellwanger. Jennifer is the president and CEO of the Data Quality Campaign, a nonprofit policy and advocacy organization really leading the effort to change the role of data to ensure that data works for everyone who's trying to navigate their education into their workforce journeys. Prior to DQC, Jen worked at every level of the education system, from a kindergarten classroom teacher to district leadership in New York and Baltimore, and most recently at the U.S. Department of Education, where she was first Director of Policy and Program Studies Services, and then later the Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy. Thank you, Jen, so much for joining us. And Jen is going to really help us set out sort of the P220 continuum and sort of how we should think about that cohesively and as a system overall. So the question for you, Jen, here at the start is, how can access to high quality, timely education data help advance success across that P20 continuum? What is one key change that could make access to actionable data possible for decision makers at multiple levels? So with that, Jen, turn it over to you. And I think you're going to share a graphic to help orient the audience to what you're talking about.
Yeah, and before we share that graphic, thank you, Bethany, and thank you to the Hunt Institute for having me on today. And, for DQC is actually celebrating our 20th year this year. And we have always been about ensuring that people have access to information that they need to make education and workforce decisions. Because one thing to remember is that data is ultimately about people. If you have one takeaway today for all of the folks joining the webinar, is that data is about people. And above all else, it is important to remember that behind every data point is a person. And when we can remember that, then this data is able to come to life and be actionable. So to help answer this question about data being about people and students, I would love to now show the graphic that we use at the Data Quality Campaign to really represent our why. And this is a vision for what data access looks like when you are going through the P20W continuum. And what I want to, we will also drop this link into the chat for folks. But this infographic follows a young girl, Grace, who is moving through key decision and transition points along her journey through school and work. And at each decision point, Grace is empowered with information about her options. And so she's able to make and choose her own pathway without having to make decisions in the dark. And that is what we hear, so often, is that people are needing to make these very important decisions, but are making them in the dark. And we don't want that to happen. We want people to have the data that they need to make those decisions. And here in this case, when you follow Grace's journey from when she was in early childhood and having a yen for science and moving on and having data and information that helped her to make decisions about her pathway, she ultimately becomes a nurse at the end of, well, it's not the end of Grace's story, but the end of this infographic, because we go on. And we want this kind of information. This is what we believe to be true for all students and job seekers alike, that impactful data access must be about meeting the needs of everyone, from students, families, and teachers, to even district and state leaders, to bring data together in different formats. That means that we're moving beyond a spreadsheet or an Excel sheet or a PDF file. This is really about thinking about how users want their data or how they need it to make decisions. So for instance, if we're thinking about K-12, teachers need to be able to interact with local and state data side by side to make comparisons. Students and family need access to tools that are built on longitudinal data, where they can see post-high school education and workforce options. And then local leaders and employers need disaggregated data on post-secondary outcomes to understand the future of workforce. So we can pull down this slide, if you don't mind. So we could just talk now without the infographic. Thank you. So I know that later in the sessions, you'll hear from Dr. Taylor and Dr. Dobbins about early childhood and post-secondary, but I'd love to zero in for just a moment on the K-12 piece of Grace's journey, Bethany. And we K-12 data is one I think that everybody is the most familiar with. State assessment data, chronic absenteeism data, those are just two of the examples of K-12 data. And and people use that in different ways. Like the state report card is one way that families are able and states are able to speak to the public about student achievement in their state and in their districts. There's also many schools and districts and states use on-track indicators with these important K-12 indicators to make determinations of how students are doing in elementary and in middle school. But I'd like to say that around K-12 data, we need to now move a step further. That is very siloed if you think about it. Even though that's like 80% of a young person's educational journey, it's still very siloed. And we need to break down those silos and start linking those data. So for instance, one thing with K-12 is to think about the data of wraparound supports. Bringing in SNAP or foster care data or Medicaid data can really help K-12 agencies support their young people and their families. And also, the one most pressing question that we get at the Data Quality Campaign, that we hear from policymakers and families alike, are most often in K-12, it's about transitions. So linking longitudinal data with K-12, from early childhood, K-12, and post-secondary workforce is really the most important thing for a K-12 data system, is to be able to link those, because we need to answer questions about kindergarten and college readiness at the same time. We need to investigate program effectiveness, dual enrollment outcomes, college remediation rates, all of these things, or persistence, or graduation outcomes. All of that requires LinkedIn data. And I know that Dr. Dobbins and Dr. Taylor will dig in a little bit more. And the way to do that is through actually all states have a statewide longitudinal data system that has the ability to connect all of these data over time, early childhood, K-12, post-secondary, and workforce. And a robust SLDS, statewide longitudinal data system, can really help provide those viable insights into the journey through ed and workforce. And, we know that states are different places in their journey to get this, but states can, if there are state policy leaders on today, the fundamental step is to start with cross-agency data governance. And that's the way that state leaders can ensure that linked data systems serve people across the state and helps to bring the leaders at the same table with these governance structures can give you what I will leave you with is the Mount Rushmore of good data. And there are 4 things that we need to think about in any way that we're providing data. And that's where the governance gets you. That data is actionable, right? You must do something. You must need to make decisions. It's accessible. You can see it, you can feel it, you can get it. It's timely. Old data is not very helpful, so it needs to be timely. And it needs to be kept secure so that you can trust the data that's needed. So with those 4 pieces and a more robust and well-rounded K-12 system, you can really start to serve the needs of both students to policymakers alike.
Jen, thanks for providing that big vision and some principles around data that we should keep in mind wherever we're talking about, in whatever part of the education continuum we're talking about. So let's get Dr. Dobbins into this conversation. So Dr. Dobbins currently serves as the Vice President of Research and Evaluation at Start Early. Her portfolio includes managing the research practice policy partnership efforts related to Start Early's Head Start grant in Chicago's EduCare site, supporting the evaluation needs for Start Early's Illinois office, managing the federal and private research contracts, and if that wasn't enough, she also leads a team of early childhood research and staffers. So thank you, Dr. Dobbins, for joining us. Jennifer was just referencing some of the ways that we can have early childhood data really inform and help us think about what happens in K through 12. But I know based on some prior comments, you really understand that there's a whole set of challenges just in the early childhood data ecosystem as well. So can you tell us more about what is that current landscape of the data that's collected in early childhood education? Who's using it, and what's that next frontier of what better could look like?
Yeah, and I know that many states are looking to do what Jennifer's talking about. One of the things I know is that in early childhood education, our data systems currently are kind of siloed. They're not as unified as some other systems. And that's due in part to the fact that ECE, or early childhood education in our country, is delivered in different ways. It's financed in different ways. The joke that I often heard during the pandemic when I was at another organization, Child Care Away of America, and we were trying to help states understand child care slots when the pandemic was closing down child care centers and parents were needing care, was you've seen one system for early care and education data systems. You've seen one system for early childhood data systems, especially when you're looking across the systems. It's truly a patchwork because it's fragmented across different funding streams. So you've got things that are coming out of HHS, things that are coming out of state, out of Department of Education, things that are coming out of states, private dollars. And governance structures, different ways that people are setting up their databases and not necessarily talking to their partners in different program types. So there's not one single agency that runs the ECE system in the United States. We also in ECE are really interested in, as Jennifer mentioned, connecting with other types of data systems like health and community and all kinds of like food and lots of different systems, because we're really looking at the entire child and the family. And so there's also interest in us making sure that we're looking at the whole child. So there's a couple of different ways that that education in early care and education is set up. And I know I'm probably talking to many people who know about early care and education, but I was also asked to kind of lay the groundwork here. We have Head Start and Early Head Start. Early Head Start serves birth to 3, and pregnant women, and Head Start serves 3 to 5. It serves low-income families, homeless families, foster children, children with disabilities. It's comprehensive. It's not just about child development, but it's about health, nutrition, and family support, and it serves about 800,000 children annually. That funding stream comes directly from the feds and goes to communities that receive grants for Head Start. They have required data that they must collect, and it's one of the most stringently monitored early care and education programs in the country. You have the Child Care Development Fund, which provides child care subsidies for low-income families. It can be for center or home-based care. There are opportunities in the fund to also provide contracts for providers and fund quality initiatives. You have the Military Child Care Program, similar, run by the Department of Defense, operates the largest employer-based child care system in the United States. Then you have state-funded pre-K. They're in 46 states and DC. It's usually 4-year-olds, sometimes 3-year-olds. It's highly variable in eligibility, quality, and hours. Some are looking at universal pre-K. Some are only targeting at-risk children. Some are operating in public schools. Some are operated in community-based centers. And then you've got the private market, where parents are bearing most of the brunt of the financing for that. And then an informal family, friend, and neighbor, which is your aunts, your uncles, your grandparents, your friends and neighbors that are taking care. So that means there's oversight that's varying, quality that's varying, requirements for data collection and reporting is varying, workforce and credentialing, which is important data for us in the early care and education field, that varies as well. Who pays is varying. And so the primary data sets for ECE are siloed. So I'll talk a little bit about efforts to integrate, which we're really excited about. But you've got the Head Start PIR, which is our program information report. That gets a lot of information, tons of information from Head Start. The Child Care Development Fund data, which usually gives us information about subsidy, expenditures, provider types, annual family characteristics. You've got the ECLS, which comes out of NCES, which is a longitudinal study set. It's for public use. It's managed by a research firm, and we're not sure about there's different cohorts for that. We're not sure how that's going to be continued. Some of the educationally funded data sets, there's not clear how we're going to, whether or not those will be continued or not. Yeah, it's very unclear. We also, like I said, use the American Community Survey. We're using population data from the census. We use the Common Core data set. Civil rights data sometimes we use. The state ESIDs, which are the early childhood integrated data systems that are available in some states. When we're interested in workforce, we're looking at workforce registries. There's a site managed by the Center for the Study of Child Care Employment, where you get a lot of data around child care employment. So basically, you can be looking at national or longitudinal outcomes with some of the larger data sets. You could be looking at program level and operational level information from the PIR and the Child Development Fund dollars. You could look at population information through the ACS and state ESIDs. And there's just no one place where we have centralized ECE data sets. So it does really require that linkage. And there's a movement to really think about how we do this at the state level and at the community level and eventually at the national level. So
that's some big challenges of fragmentation, both about who the providers are in ECE and what is the kind of data that we could draw on. I'm curious, maybe just to continue to have you speak to the audience a little bit. You mentioned that there's efforts at the state and local level that are sort of pointing the direction of where we can go. Can you name just one? Who do you see as like really leading the field in terms of what this could look like, what good could look like moving forward?
I think There are some different communities that are doing it. I'm in Illinois. We're Start Early is in Illinois, and we are definitely they're one of the states that's doing pretty well. We also, though, know that there are, I'd say the state of North Carolina is doing a really good job of linking the data in early care and education, and also thinking about linking across the continuum. They've done a lot of good work around um, using that data. They provide dashboards that are available for folks to see and policymakers to use, so they can they're good at, like, they've been using it to target um, areas and communities that don't have access to early care and education, those child care deserts, as some would call them. They've also they've also been able to use it to secure more dollars for early care and education. They also have reports that can be spit out of their work that really answers questions that can be used for both policymakers and parents. And so I think they're farther along than some states, but I think there's sort of a group of kind of emerging, doing fairly well, and really thinking about it and learning from the lessons of those who've had ESIDS for a while, and then states that are doing, that are leading the charge.
Oh, I really appreciate that case example, because you got into the specifics around how a state or a system could really use data to drive towards additional financial resources and address access issues within their state. That is I was so appreciative of that example. And it kind of tees us up well to go to the other end of the education continuum to get Dr. Taylor in this conversation, where she's really been pioneering and supporting use at an institutional level and use amongst faculty and staff to use data to drive towards more institutional performance of their university. But let me do the formal introduction of Dr. Taylor. Similar to our other two panelists, she's highly accomplished, but she's the Associate Provost for Institutional Effectiveness and Analytics at Ohio University. She is leading the university's transformation from a more traditional IR office to more proactive and responsive decision support unit. Love that turn of phrase. That's focused on developing an enterprise-wide culture of converting data to insights for decision-making. In a prior role, she designed and implemented a comprehensive student success program at Paul Smith's College that built on effective data use and actually won a couple of awards. There were so many awards, I was like, I got to cut this from her bio. So we're really thrilled to involve her in this conversation. And just to tee you up, Dr. Taylor, your work has focused on strategies that support effective data literacy. So tell us more about what that looks like. How have you helped faculty and staff to understand data and to use it to make changes in their policies and practices that contributes to that longer, bigger institutional performance? So Dr. Taylor?
So it was really interesting hearing the other panelists already talk about challenges in terms of this longitudinal data set, but we have real challenges even within single institutions in higher education. I hope everyone read that IHEP paper on University of North Texas. They've done a fantastic job. They've been an aspirational office for me to follow as I've tried to move my institution forward along this data literacy journey in terms of building a culture of effective data use. So everyone's probably heard for at least 15 years now that higher education is data rich and information poor, right? And it continues to be true. Almost everything we do and our students do leave a data trail, digital exhaust of data. But developing a culture of data literacy, which allows us to use data effectively in decision making, it's not a quick win. It's not low-hanging fruit. It's a time and resource-intensive journey that takes sustained institutional will to succeed. And it's a cultural shift. And we all know that culture takes a long time to change and develop. Our institutions still face a ton of technology challenges which impact their ability to collect and analyze data for decision making. But today we're actually going to talk about our most difficult and hard to overcome challenge, which, as you might have guessed, is people. The people themselves are our most difficult challenge in terms of helping them understand the importance of using data, how to use data. There was this big call in higher education over the last 5 to 10 years. It is all about self-serve analytics. If we can just put out these self-serve dashboards, people will come, they will use the data in decision making, and the bright and shining future of higher education. Spoiler alert, that did not actually happen. I'm sure everyone is shocked, but people are people, and it's difficult to help them take on a new skill, which is what this is. And so we discovered that making something, even something that people say they want, even something that is useful to them, they may not know how to use it. They may not have the time or the cognitive bandwidth to learn how to use it. And even if they want to use it and have the time, they do not know how that might be relevant to their job. Remember, they've been doing their jobs for 5, 10, 20 plus years without these data. And they're like, I'm really good at decision making in my job. I don't see how this data is going to make me better at that. And so these are all things that we are having to overcome strategically through thinking about our data literacy. So some of the strategies that we've been employing that seem to be very effective, one is that when people look at data, they often think there's going to be a pop quiz. They get really nervous about it, and they're like, oh my gosh, what if I don't know what that data is telling me? Or what if I don't know what the answer is? And so one of the biggest things that we have to do is we have to take that anxiety away by reminding people that data aren't going to like flash an answer like 42 at them, right? Data is about exploring what's going on and asking more questions. And when you look at a dashboard, you should come away with more questions that you then need to go back and think about. We teach a framework of data literacy. So it's a 5-step framework where we are teaching them. The first step is about asking your question, right? Is it a good question? Does it help you select the right kinds of data, reports, or dashboards? When you look at those data, are they answering those questions? Do you understand what the trends you're seeing? Are there things that are happening? In all of our data systems right now, we have a big asterisk next to 2020 and 2021 because that's where all the data goes completely wonky due to the pandemic. We ask them to interpret what they're seeing. Are there those trends or gaps? Can you think back to business processes that changed? Etc. Do they have questions about why the data look that way? Do they need to look at additional data? And then finally, how do they inform other people about what they found? How do they communicate those results? So we're very intentional about how we teach that data literacy process and remind them that it is iterative. That seems to help. When we are designing information products for people, we think about the end user. Is a student going to be looking at this, a parent, a faculty member, a dean, or senior leadership? And then we think about the different data personas we have on campus with different data literacies. I'm sure everyone knows people like these, but we think about the data avoidant person, right? Who likes to say, well, I really know how we're doing in my heart. I don't need to look at data. The novice data user who might be really intimidated by what they're looking at. The data fluents. We also have data super users that are going to challenge us on the data and like, well, why did you do it that way? And then also our most feared user is actually the data overconfidence. who they think they can just take all those numbers and run with them without understanding the limitations of the data, etc. So we really try to give people multiple on-ramps to the data. A couple of years ago, I had a department chair that actually said, you know, I've tried using your dashboards, but I can't look at 4 visualizations. I can't look at 4 graphs at the same time. And we were like, okay, so we've gone back and we now have what we are called our quick look dashboards, which is just one graph or one table on a tab, so that people with that lower level of data literacy are comfortable looking at it, and we can hopefully move them up that data literacy curve. One of the big things we've discovered, and I'm sure the other panelists have discovered this too, you can't just push out data to people. You have to work with your senior leaders to develop a pull for data, because no matter how hard you're giving people data, they're not really going to start to use it until they are expected to use it. So even if you're supporting them with education and other resources, you need senior leadership to model good behavior in terms of reviewing data, asking for data when there's a decision to be made. Are there data we should be looking at to inform this decision? And that is a big one. The other one is we have some community groups. So we're trying to develop communities of practice around different types of data use. We have what we call our data reporting and user group, or our drug group, that we look at different types of data throughout the year. They meet once a month. Anyone can join that group. We go over definitions of the month, where we review common definitions in the data. We go over reports that have recently been updated with them. And sometimes we have what we call our data nerd of the month, who comes in to talk about how they are using data as an end user in their roles to show people why having data is helpful to them.
Dr. Taylor, thank you for that. I love the sort of really tactical suggestions around how to engage stakeholders to understand and then use data. I was taking notes because that's part of my role here at Ascendium. I'm going to do a little bit of a pivot, and then we are going to start to turn to the Q&A. So thank you for folks who've started to contribute. We will get to you in just a second. But I sort of want to go out to the full panel with one question. And it relates to something that all of you have touched on, and really going back to Jen's earlier comment around like data as people. Like, we know data represents children, learners, workers within our communities. And one of the things I often ask when I'm looking at data is who's in the data and who's not. And so I'm curious, as you all think about the current landscape of the data that you're working with in early childhood or in higher ed or K through 12, how are you seeing, how can we make sure that data is collected, is representative of the very communities and varied types of students we have in our systems? And just to say, you know, we're operating and having this conversation around data as our federal administration enacts many different changes in the types of data that are collected and the ways in which they are collected. So I'm curious, how do we continue to make sure that we've got data that's comprehensive of all of the people in our community, that we really need to understand what's happening with them and how our systems and institutions serving them? Big, meaty question. Dr. Dobbins, you started sort of on this when you were talking about those early childhood deserts in North Carolina. Would love just to hear more of your reflections on getting to that representative data.
Yeah, I think that it's going to be a challenge, and especially in early care and education, because we've got so many different places where this is happening. However, I think that one of the things that many states are interested in that ESIDS model, where you're looking at data from many different places. But I think one of the things that will be helpful is if we think about how we ensure that people are that states or communities are collecting the same type of data, that it's kind of one of the things we talk about is it being harmonized, right? So, for example, we know that I shared an article with the team before the meeting, before this webinar, where and a website, Child Trends, has a great set of papers and work that they have on with the Early Childhood Data Collective. They've been looking at integration data systems in early care and education for a long while. But they talk about using the Common Education Data Standards, it's a framework that came out of the Department of Education, where it talks about emphasizing standardized data structures, aligning data definitions, ensuring that we're comparing apples to apples and instead of apples to oranges, making sure that there's a way that people have resources or toolkits, or that there's examples that they can follow to create these systems. So like having those case studies and the stories from North Carolina or other places, having toolkits to say, this is what we did when we did our work. We had a governance work committee, and that included people from all over ECE, or like really making sure that there is, I don't want to say hand-holding, but some guidance when folks are trying to do this. It's not easy to do, but I think people want to do it, but they're not quite sure how to start it. And so I think it's really important to have some guidance. And I think that one paper that I shared from Child Trends about using the Common Education Data Standards as a framework to help states really think about, or communities really think about, the data that they're collecting and that they're aligning, and being really intensive about making sure that the definitions make sense, that they're asking the same questions, that these are making sure that the data that they're getting out of their systems makes sense for the outcomes and the reporting and the problems that they're trying to solve. So that paper, I think, is really helpful if folks are trying to do that, because it gives next steps to eventually build a cohesive, data-informed, decision-ready system. And particularly, this is focused on early care and education, but I think it would be something that the other systems could use as well.
I really appreciate that, and appreciate lifting up a resource so that our audience members know you don't have to do this alone. Others have figured out some of these things, and you can leverage those lessons learned. But in this question of, how do we ensure that data that is collected is representative of our varied communities, that we are comprehensive in who is included and attentive to understanding the unique experiences of particular populations. I want to get other folks in the conversation. So Jen, perspectives, you had a profile of Gracie, I think it was, in your flow, but Gracie's just one type of student, one individual. How do you think about getting to data that might be representative of groups of different students?
So one thing that, we always talk about, what I started with, is that data is about people. And you know what the thing is about people? They don't use data they don't trust. And data moves at the speed of trust. So how do you get there, Bethany, is really the question that you are asking. And the way to do that is actually through proactive community engagement. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And DQC recently put out a brief on what is actually best practices here. And it's not just, sending it to some of your community groups after you put out the data and say, here you go, folks, that's it. Because what they say, Bethany, what oftentimes they'll say is, well, what is this data? Who is represented within the data? And, how is it collected and who is it being used for? And so, how you avoid asking those questions after is bringing folks in on the front end to start at the beginning of a data collection process, saying, you know what, we're going to be beginning a data collection on student, graduation outcomes. And we want to talk to you about how these data will be used. who will be in it, how will it be represented, et cetera. And that is how you start to lift the veil, because the best, sunlight, we say, is the best disinfectant. And that means that these practices need to be transparent. And states have limited time and capacity, and always community engagement, however you want to think about it, is always the afterthought because everyone's so busy doing. But I'll tell you what's really much more expensive is having to redo these things because you misrepresented a student group, or you left something out, or again, it's not the calculations weren't done correctly because you missed something when you didn't include the others in the community. The other thing is, I would say, is making sure that data that you are sharing and publishing is disaggregated. And that is a real key to making sure, Bethany, to your question, who is in these data and how are they being represented? Information about student performance broken down by different student groups and that makes it easy to find and understand for educators, policymakers, and alike to dig in to what's working and for whom. And that really enables transparency. Just having an all student or an all category doesn't actually get to what's working and for whom.
It's a great response. And I'm going to use moderator's prerogative to double click on something you said, Jennifer, in part because it relates to a question we got in the Q&A, which is, you're describing some upfront practices and some analysis practices, upfront practices around community engagement to help folks understand the kind of data we're collecting and why we're collecting it. And the data analysis practices like disaggregation to be clear about who's included and how we're arriving at conclusions around what works and for whom. But the questioner in the Q&A points out that these data conversations aren't happening for the first time. We've been having data collection and data use over decades, and there's some real harm that prior use and collection has created in the past.
A lot of distrust,
Yeah, would love you to talk a little bit, and this is going off of what the person said, but how do you repair when that does happen? Do you have any ideas about how you repair? And then what would you do in the future to help ensure that data isn't misused and that we still are collecting the data and using it in ways that can help those most vulnerable young learners? So a little bit of a double click. Thanks, Jen.
Well, definitely. So I have been in the seat, and I have the scars to prove that it doesn't always go so well. And I have often, I like to say not often, but there have been times where rollouts of data have not been very well because I rolled out where are they now reports to principals, or chronic absenteeism reports to principals, and they said, well, wait a second, you want us to go to action when we are not even understanding what's in the data or what's represented here. So you know what you do? You hit the reset button. You take a step back and you start at the beginning again. And you bring, for instance, principals along in the decisions, and also get their feedback, why that decision might not have made sense. And sometimes, we always want to go faster, but in the end, we go faster, we go further faster together than we do it when we go alone. So it is okay to backtrack. And that is actually, I think, a very big trust builder. And the way to avoid that is for those folks that are going to have a lot to say about these data. And I'm not just even talking about the actual data themselves, but how it looks, right? Dr. Taylor talked about, the different ways that data are presented. Those are ways to get people engaged. Is this the dashboard, the kind of the right level, or is it something else? What would help you to become engaged with these data? What will help you act on them? Asking and eliciting those questions at the front end and not afterward is going to save you so much time and also build that trust that you are looking for. And again, these are, we talk about how hard it is to link data and everything. These are the technology is not the issue here. We are always going to come down to people and relationships. And that's, Bethany, the way that you build the trust. That is the way that you build the data system, is through these relationships. And I would go, data governance is that way to bring everybody together, have a strong data governance policy. Also, because people are scared, like, you're using my data to do what? Well,
Mhm.
you need to have assurances around policies, around, and that's the data governance, is how will you keep that data safe and secure while also providing access?
Can I just hop in on that real quick?
Yes, I'll take a break.
Yeah, one of the things that has come up is you had mentioned who's represented in the data, right? And that is just so critical, because we have had rules where when there are small data numbers, those numbers are suppressed. And like historically, for institutional research offices, if there are only 3 Native Hawaiians, we don't even show that category on our websites. And so there has really been a lot of talk over the last 5 years about, wait a minute, we are erasing the experience that these people with these identities are in higher education, but you would never know it. And so sometimes, again, tactically, there are things you can do to promote the visibility and the representation and show people who are in the data. And what we do now is we show all of the categories and we put an asterisk or something and say, the data have been suppressed due to low numbers. But we've been working very hard to also take ownership of when we have what we used to call equity gaps between low socioeconomic students and others. Ohio University actually has an access mission. We are the only opportunity university, R1 research university in the state of Ohio. We have an access mission to the people of rural Appalachia. Here in Southeast Ohio. And so we track a lot of local, socioeconomic status. Are they Pell eligible? But then we also look across other identities like first generation. Do they have that college going capital? And we try to look at that. These aren't student gaps, but they're institutional performance gaps if we are not helping all of our students achieve the outcomes that we want them to achieve. And so sometimes it's also a matter of language and how we talk about these data to the different communities that make them more comfortable with the data, because we're not saying, oh, we have these student performance gaps, it's on the student to meet our standards, where no, we have institutional performance gaps and we should be taking students from where they are and moving them to where we want them to be.
Yeah. Can I actually give an example of how we really think about ensuring that voices are heard and that data is usable? For our EduCare program and our Head Start sites, we do what we call research practice partnerships. And that's where one of the big things in the very beginning of any engagement that we have with our staff is that we talk to them about being almost like co-PIs, right? They're equal to us in terms of helping us think about what the issue is that they want to study. So sometimes we'll look at data and what the data is telling us, trends, what we're seeing in our deep dives. Other times we'll be hearing just that there's an issue rising up and there's something that needs to be solved. And with them, come up with the research question, the hypotheses. We will also help them think about what the reasons for why they think these things are happening. So we'll do that, have them really think about what the root causes of some of the issues are that they have. And from getting those root causes, help them think about what a possible solution is or what a possible tweak to the process or the issue is. And with that, we ask them to go ahead and we agree on what the new process would be or what the new solution would be, have them do that work. And then we come back as researchers and, do some analysis of whether things changed or whether the system was better or whether the outcomes were better. And we have a conversation about that as well. Then after we have that conversation, we decide, is this where you want to be? Or does it continue to be, do we need to continue to tweak this? Do we need to think about a different way of doing this work? So it's an iterative process. They're involved from the beginning. They're helping us with the not just coming up with the hypotheses and implementing and helping us understand the data. Afterwards, we'll have a data dialogue with them where we share the data with them. And we're also looking for them to give us the context. They understand what's happening in their program and why things might look the way they look. We might interpret it one way, but they also can give us the context that we, coming in from outside, might not have. And then even recently, we've included them in presentations and in sharing the actual results and the process of the RPP. So I mean, that's a small example. We're working at the program level with teachers and with program directors, but I think we could think about that in our work as much as possible if we're able to include the people that we're studying or the people that we're working with as part of our research team. And, not only have them think about the beginning stages of it, but help us understand what it means and how we're going to utilize that data in the end.
Really appreciate that. RPPs, research practice partnerships, can be really powerful approaches to getting data to folks who can use it. So love that. And I'm not surprised that it was a question from somebody in the audience who triggered such a good dialogue between our three panelists. I'm looking, there is one question here coming in that sort of goes a little bit deeper on this issue of like who's in our data and how do we ensure trust and use of that data by various communities, which is specifically, can we get examples of how you have championed or used intersectional data? So data at the intersection of maybe one or two or more identities with various actors in your particular part of the education continuum. So, maybe I'll go to you, Dr. Taylor, because you mentioned both looking at sort of students of different socioeconomic statuses and backgrounds, as well as different identity groups. Do you have experience with really championing and using more intersectional data to get even more fine-grained disaggregations that Jen was talking about earlier? What did that look like?
So we do. At my previous institution and my current institution, we traditionally find that anytime you are looking at underrepresented groups, whether that's low socioeconomic, first generation, or underrepresented minority populations, there is definitely an effect. And it is almost an additive effect for the institutional performance gap, which surprises a lot of people on campus. We use it from an approach that we want to float all boats, right? And there's lots of research out there around student success, et cetera, that shows that when you are providing the level of support and information that your students with the least college-going capital knowledge, right, how to navigate college, et cetera, when you are using that kind of universal design to design systems and information that meets the need of that group, you will see all of your groups improve. Because within any group, overall, they might be less at risk, but they are going to have students within that group that are going to be at risk or need additional supports to be successful. So figuring out what supports those are that support everyone helps everybody. So I hope that answered the question. That's how we use it.
I think it did, and it did well, because you really pointed to that use of using a disaggregation, looking at how different identities intersect to really understand the students and then meet them where they're at to get them to that overall institutional goal you have. say of graduation. I
Bethany,
see Jen wants
just
to
want
get
to add
in.
just like
Yeah.
one cautionary note on that, because again, if we're talking about building trust, we want to make sure that we are answering the question, who needs access to what data, and you know, at what level they need it. So when we're, especially as we're starting to drill down on maybe what we would call like these cross tabulations of data or intersectional, we really want to make sure that first and foremost, we are following all privacy, you know, laws, so that we make sure that data are kept secure and there's no personally identifiable data. Because again, we want to be ethically responsible. We are data stewards. We are not data owners. And so we want to have this data, but also having the considerations in place about who needs what data at what level is really important in order for us to make sure that we have these linked data for P20W, because we want people to have the trust in the data and not feel exposed or scared or nervous.
Thank
A
you,
great
Jennifer.
point. And I think I need to hand it over to Megan, who's going to wrap us up. I'll just acknowledge that we didn't get to all of the questions and the Q&A. Thankfully, our panelists were typing in responses to some folks, but I hope that just means that there's appetite for attending the next 2 webinars that the Hunt Institute is going to put on. So thank you, big thank you to our panelists and to Hunt and to all of you who asked such good questions. And now over to Megan.
Thank you so much, Bethany. I wish we could keep this conversation going, but we're about at the time. Thank you all for joining us today and engaging into this informative discussion. Before closing today, I wanted to share some links to our next webinar. Our September webinar will continue on September 30th at 2 p.m. So please join for that. We'll also be sending an email with a recap with the registration link. Thank you again for joining us today. I hope you guys all have a great week.
Yeah.
We'll see you in September.
Bye-bye.
Bye.